A man wakes up on a cot, head pounding, walls unfamiliar. He assumes he's in a detox clinic. The police picked him up the night before. He isn't. He's in a military enlistment office. His signature is already on the papers. What you're about to hear isn't a story about one unlucky drunk. It's a story about a military machine so desperate for bodies that it is now raiding the streets, the classrooms, and the factory floors of its own country. 5 consecutive months where Russia has lost more soldiers than it has managed to recruit. Stay with this, because the number you think you know is only the floor. How many soldiers do you think Russia is losing every single day on the Ukrainian battlefield right now? Hold that number in your head. By the time this is over, you'll want to revise it. Picture a ledger. On the left side, the soldiers Russia buries or medevacs out of Ukraine each month. On the right, the fresh recruits it manages to sign up and push toward the front. For most of this war, that ledger was roughly balanced. Ugly, but functional. April 2026 is the month the right column fell decisively, permanently short. Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov confirmed on May 5th that 35,230 Russian military personnel were either killed or seriously wounded in April alone. That figure matches almost exactly what Ukraine recorded in March, 35,351, with one critical difference. March has one extra day. Adjust April to the same length, and Ukraine would have shattered its own monthly record by approximately 1,000 casualties. The death count is climbing. The calendar is not helping Russia. What that daily figure looks like in practice: roughly 1,174 Russian soldiers removed from the battlefield every 24 hours. That is not a rounding error or a propaganda estimate. Every single casualty in Fedorov's count is confirmed on video through Ukraine's Army of Drones system, a point we will return to shortly. For the viewer trying to picture the scale, that is roughly the entire population of a small town erased from Russia's military roster every month. Not wounded lightly, destroyed or seriously wounded, out of the fight, possibly permanently. This is now the 5th consecutive month that Ukraine has achieved this. December, January, February, March, April. 5 months in a row where the losses exceed what Russia can replace. That is no longer a trend. That is a structural problem wearing a uniform. Every number Ukraine publishes comes with footage. That is the architecture of the Army of Drones system, and it matters enormously for understanding why these figures carry weight that most wartime casualty statistics do not. Ukraine's system offers bonus points to soldiers who upload drone strike footage that results in confirmed casualties. Those points are redeemable for drone equipment, which means the incentive to record and upload is baked directly into the economics of staying alive at the front. Fedorov described the outcome plainly. The Ministry of Defense can watch every single casualty take place. The system gives commanders a precise picture of which units and weapons are performing, how deep the damage runs, and what the enemy's daily losses look like in real time. This isn't estimated. It's witnessed, filed, and time-stamped. Here is where it becomes even more significant. The 156,735 Russian casualties confirmed between December 2025 and April 2026 represent only what drone footage has captured. Every artillery strike that occurs outside a drone's field of view adds to the real number without adding to the official count. Every medium-range strike against a command post or logistics hub scores casualties that no drone records. The confirmed figure is the absolute minimum. The real number sits somewhere above it. How far above, nobody outside Russian military hospitals currently knows. The consequence for how we read Russia's recruitment shortfall is significant. The 8,300 soldier monthly gap between losses and recruits is calculated against Ukraine's floor figure. Measure it against the ceiling, and the hole gets wider. Here is a number that reframes the entire war in a single breath. The Ukrainian Unmanned Systems Forces, the USF, calculated the average cost of eliminating one Russian soldier in April 2026. That cost? $882. Russia pays recruits more than that just to sign up. Robert Bravi, commander of Ukraine's USF, confirmed that his forces were responsible for striking 10,581 Russian troops in April. That figure alone is striking, but the economics behind it are what make it devastating. A drone that costs a few $100s in plastic, wire, and a commercial camera is now sufficient to permanently remove a soldier from the battlefield, along with everything he carries, every ruble spent training him, and every signing bonus Russia paid to get him there in the first place. Bravi described it as exchanging enemy resources for the cost of a drone, and called it one of the most effective exchange rates in modern warfare. It is difficult to find a serious counterargument. There is a second layer worth sitting with here. The USF accounted for roughly 1/3 of Ukraine's confirmed April casualties. The remaining 2/3 came from regular Ukrainian ground troops who are not part of the USF, but are operating their own drones independently. Ukraine has essentially distributed its drone lethality across the entire army, not concentrated it in one specialist unit. That distribution makes the casualty engine significantly harder to disrupt. Destroy one USF depot, and the other 2/3 of the kill rate continues uninterrupted. The benchmark Bravi is chasing is for at least 30% of all USF engagements to result in personnel casualties. Over the past 11 months, the rate has sat at 29.59%. The gap is narrow. When it closes, the monthly figures go higher still.
What does an army look like when the math stops working in its favor? Not in the dramatic, cinematic sense of a front line collapsing overnight, but in the slow, grinding, institutional sense of a force that is being quietly hollowed out from the inside. Russia is providing the answer to that question in real time, and it is not a pretty picture. Between December 2025 and April 2026, Russia recruited 148,400 personnel, while losing a confirmed 156,735. That is a shortfall of approximately 8,300 soldiers over 5 months, which works out to a net reduction of around 1,660 fighters per month. United 24 Media confirmed these figures. On its own, that number sounds manageable, but Russia's entire strategy depends on having more bodies than Ukraine. A shrinking army is a dying strategy. The logic of Russia's war from the beginning has been attrition by mass. Send enough soldiers, absorb enough Ukrainian firepower, and eventually the defending side breaks first. That strategy requires a numerical advantage that is self-replenishing. The moment recruitment cannot keep pace with losses, the strategy begins consuming itself. Russia is not building on what it has. It is not even replacing what it loses. It is contracting, slowly but measurably, every single month. The consequences compound. Undermanned units get stretched across the same frontage. Experienced soldiers carry more of the load. Fatigue accelerates attrition further. The shortfall in one month makes the shortfall in the next month slightly worse. It is not a cliff edge, it is a slope, and Russia is already on it. Defense Minister Fedorov has set a target of 50,000 Russian casualties per month as the threshold at which Russia cannot sustain its invasion. April's figure of 35,230 is still 15,000 short of that mark. The slope has further to go. A year ago, Russia was signing up between 1,000 and 1,200 soldiers every single day. That pace was barely sufficient to match the casualty rate Ukraine was inflicting at the time. Fast forward to the first quarter of 2026, and that daily recruitment figure has dropped to approximately 800. The losses got worse. The recruits got fewer. Those two lines crossed, and that crossing is what produced the 5-month shortfall we have been tracking. What makes this collapse particularly striking is that it is happening while Russia is throwing staggering sums of money at the problem. The Russian federal government now offers a standard signing bonus of 400,000 rubles, approximately $5,300. Regional authorities then stack their own incentives on top, pushing the average total for a new volunteer recruit to 1.47 million rubles, or just over $19,600, simply for putting a signature on a contract. Militarny confirmed both the recruitment drop and the bonus figures in an April 13th report. Russia is paying more than ever for soldiers it cannot find. The pressure on regional governments to hit quotas has become so severe that some are now spending up to 10% of their entire annual budgets on recruitment incentives alone.
That is money extracted directly from housing, healthcare, and infrastructure budgets. Russian civilians are watching their local services erode in real time to fund a war that is consuming the men those services are supposed to support. Injury compensation sits at $36,000. Death payments are supposed to reach the soldier's family if he is killed. The word "supposed" is doing significant work in that sense, given what independent Russian journalists have documented about delayed and disputed payments. Even at face value, the incentive structure reveals something important. Russia has run out of ideological arguments for this war and replaced them entirely with cash. When the cash stops working, there is nothing left to offer.
That is the first half of this picture, and it is already damning. But what comes next is where Russia's desperation stops being a policy problem and starts becoming a human one. If this breakdown of the numbers is giving you a clearer picture of where this war is actually heading, hit subscribe so you never miss an analysis like this. The second half of what we are about to show you is where things get genuinely dark for Putin, and genuinely revealing about how close to the edge he really is.
Gabor Sabinich did not decide to go to war. He decided to have a few drinks. Police picked him up off the street, and when he opened his eyes the next morning, he was on a cot in a room he did not recognize. He assumed it was a detox center. It was a military enlistment office. His signature was already on the contract. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty broke this story in an April 2nd report, and Sabinich's case is not an isolated incident. It is, according to the reporting, becoming a pattern. The mechanics are straightforward and deeply cynical. Russian police detain intoxicated individuals. Instead of processing them through standard detention, they are transferred to enlistment offices. Paperwork is completed while the person is still impaired or unconscious. By the time clarity returns, the legal obligation exists. You can be conscripted into a war before you sober up. Set this against everything we have covered so far. The $19,600 signing bonuses, the collapsing recruitment quotas, the regional governors spending 10% of their budgets on incentives, and a clear picture emerges. The financial carrots have stopped working on Russians who are sober and making conscious choices. So the system is now reaching for people who are not in a position to make any choice at all. This is not a military recruitment strategy. It is a press gang operating inside a country that is not officially at war. The tactical result is predictable. Soldiers who did not choose to be there have no investment in the outcome and arrive at the front with resentment rather than motivation. An army built on coercion and alcohol is not an army that holds ground under pressure. It is an army that looks for the first available exit.
Russia's Minister for Science and Higher Education, Valery Falov, issued a directive to the country's universities with a specific numerical target. At least 2% of enrolled students should be signing contracts with the Russian Defense Ministry. Pravda reported the figure. At current enrollment numbers, that translates to a minimum of 44,000 university students heading toward Ukraine per year. Expand the mandate to include other further education institutions, and the number climbs to 76,000. These are not soldiers. These are students who enrolled to build careers, not to fill casualty statistics. The pressure being applied to achieve that target is where it becomes genuinely disturbing. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty reported in February that students at Russia's Higher School of Economics were being presented with a binary choice: sign a defense ministry contract or face expulsion. Other universities followed. Grace periods for missed assignments have been cut to as little as 2 weeks in some institutions, with the same ultimatum attached at the end of them. Russia has turned its lecture halls into a recruitment conveyor belt. The same logic has been applied to the workplace. In Ryazan, the regional governor issued an order requiring companies with up to 300 employees to nominate 2 candidates for military contracts. Companies with 500 or more employees must nominate 5. The language of the order uses the broad terms organizations and institutions, which opens the directive to hospitals, research bodies, and public sector offices. The economic consequence of this is one Russia cannot afford to ignore.
Every student pulled from a university and every skilled worker pulled from a factory represents a compounding withdrawal from the productive capacity of an economy already buckled under sanctions. Russia is not just losing soldiers, it is consuming the people who were supposed to rebuild it after the war ends.
There is a network operating across multiple countries with a single purpose: move vulnerable migrants toward a Russian military contract by any means available. The carrot is usually Russian citizenship, supplemented by the same high pay being dangled in front of domestic recruits. What the migrants are rarely told clearly is where they are actually going. Ukrainian intelligence identified 27,447 foreign nationals fighting inside Russia's army as of March 30th, 2026. That figure was approximately 18,000 in November 2025. In 4 months, it grew by nearly 10,000. On May 5th, the UK responded by unleashing a new round of sanctions targeting 35 individuals and entities directly involved in facilitating this migrant pipeline into the Russian military. The Moscow Times reported the sanctions and the UK's characterization of the network as barbaric, a system designed to exploit people with limited options and redirect them into a war that has nothing to do with them. Putin is not recruiting soldiers anymore. He is trafficking desperation. The battlefield utility of these recruits is where Russia's desperation becomes self-defeating. Most do not speak Russian. They cannot properly understand orders relayed in the middle of a firefight. They arrive with minimal training and no cultural connection to the cause they are nominally fighting for. A soldier who does not understand his orders in a fluid combat situation is not a reinforcement. He is a liability that consumes logistics, medical resources, and the attention of the experienced soldiers around him. Russia's April plan, revealed by Ukrainian intelligence, targets 18,500 new foreign recruits for 2026. At current monthly casualty rates, that covers roughly half a month of losses. It is a sticking plaster on a wound that requires surgery. If the US and EU follow the UK with matching sanctions, even that partial solution disappears.
What does a leader do when financial incentives fail? When students and factory workers are being press-ganged, when drunks are being signed up off the streets, and when foreign migrants trafficked into uniform are still not closing the gap? There is one move left. Putin knows it. His spokesman is already preparing the Russian public for it. On May 3rd, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov was quoted by TASS warning that Europe is mobilizing its forces and that a period of tough confrontation is looming. Read that statement not as foreign policy analysis, but as domestic messaging. Peskov is not describing a threat from Europe. He is constructing a justification for asking Russian citizens to accept something they have spent 4 years hoping to avoid. When the Kremlin justifies mobilization out loud, the decision is made. Euronews reported in February that the Kremlin was developing a limited conscription system for involuntary call-ups of reserves. That is not full mobilization yet, but the architecture is being built. The distance between a limited reserve call-up and a full national mobilization is shorter than most people assume, and Russia is walking it in one direction only. The political risk for Putin here is enormous, and he understands it precisely. Partial mobilization in September 2022 triggered the largest exodus of Russians since the Soviet collapse. Hundreds of thousands left within weeks. Full mobilization would dwarf that. It would confirm to every Russian family that the war their government called a special military operation is now consuming their sons unconditionally. That is the outcome Ukraine has been engineering with every drone strike, every confirmed casualty, every month of recruitment shortfall. Not a battlefield breakthrough, a domestic crisis inside Russia that Putin cannot manage from behind a lectern. Winter slows everything in Ukraine. Frozen ground hardens into something tanks and infantry columns can actually move across. But a thawing spring turns that same ground into a swamp that bogs down offensive operations and forces soldiers to bunch up on the few navigable routes. Russia's April territorial performance reflected exactly that. April 2026 marked Russia's first net territorial loss since August 2024, recorded while its soldiers were wading through mud that made large-scale assaults nearly impossible.
Those are the casualty figures Ukraine posted against a Russian force that was not fully attacking. Summer changes that calculation completely. Terrain solidifies. Putin's attrition by mass strategy depends on throwing as many assault waves as possible at Ukrainian defensive lines and accepting catastrophic losses in exchange for incremental ground. When the ground firms up, those assault waves resume at full intensity. Ukraine's drone networks, which already confirmed 35,240 casualties in April against a reduced tempo of Russian attacks, will be processing a significantly higher volume of targets. April's record was set in the mud. Summer has no mud. Layer Ukraine's medium-range strike campaign on top of that. Ukraine media reported a sharp escalation in Ukrainian strikes in the 20 to 150 kilometer range during April, double the number recorded in March and 4 times the February figure. Every command post, logistics hub, and supply depot destroyed in that range degrades the support infrastructure that keeps frontline soldiers functional. Degrade the support, and the frontline soldiers become more exposed. More exposed soldiers produce more casualties. Ukraine is not waiting for summer to arrive. It is systematically dismantling the Russian military's ability to sustain an offensive before that offensive begins. By the time the ground hardens, the structure supporting Russia's assault capacity will be measurably weaker than it is today. The casualty figures we have been discussing are not the peak. They are the baseline.
5 months of confirmed data point to a single conclusion that no amount of Kremlin messaging can obscure. Russia is losing soldiers faster than it can replace them, spending unsustainable sums to recruit people it cannot retain, and cannibalizing its universities, its workforce, and its streets to keep the numbers from collapsing entirely. The mobilization that Putin has spent 4 years avoiding is no longer a question of political will. It is a question of arithmetic, and arithmetic does not negotiate. The move Putin makes next, forced, cornered, and running out of options, may ultimately do more damage to his hold on power than any weapon Ukraine has fielded. If you want to understand exactly how Ukraine has engineered this position, watch our next video, where we break down how Ukraine turned Russia's war of attrition completely on its head and built the kill zones that are doing the real work behind these numbers.